Welcome to my TT Wine Explorer podcast. I'm your host, Tania Tomaszewska. This podcast is about my deep dive into the wide world of wine and some of the discussions which I have along the way. It's about my adventures as a former banking lawyer turned wine industry professional and everyday wine lover turned committed cork dork. Wine is about a lot of things: geography, climate, farming, viticulture, chemistry, engineering, flavors, the world of the senses, business, passion, story, family, just to name a few of the elements. But wine is also about history. And for today's episode, I've decided to focus on one aspect of early 20th century North American history, the era of Prohibition. For me, this topic is not only very interesting, but it's also a critical part of understanding the complex web of rules and regulations which govern how many of us here in North America make, sell, experience, and enjoy wine. I can't think of a better person to discuss this with than my colleague Mark Hicken. Although he is now retired from the practice of law, Mark was previously a well-known wine and liquor industry lawyer with more than 15 years of experience in liquor policy issues. In 2017, Mark was appointed as policy advisor to the British Columbia government in relation to liquor policy and was tasked with making recommendations to improve our liquor policy and regulations in this province. Mark speaks frequently at wine industry conferences and is often quoted in media about issues relating to wine and liquor policy. And most recently, Mark has become the executive director for the Canadian Association for Responsible Drinkers, which we'll speak about later in this episode. I hope that you enjoy my discussion with Mark Hicken today. Let's fly. Hi, Mark. Welcome to the TT Wine Explorer podcast. Thanks so much for joining as my guest today.
Well, hi, Tania. Thank you very much for having me on.
So we've got a lot of territory to cover here. But before we dive into a discussion about prohibition and modern day rules and regulations around alcohol, I'd like to chat a little bit about your background and how you got into all of this. As I recall, we first met a long time ago when we were both working at the same law firm here in Vancouver. I then went off to live and work and have an adventure in Australia. And when I came back to settle in Vancouver almost 15 later, you'd become one of British Columbia's and Canada's leading wine lawyers and experts in liquor policy. To say that wine law and liquor policy expertise is specialized is an understatement. There aren't a lot of experts like you around. These are not topics that we learned about in law school. So can you share a little bit about what prompted you to become involved in this area and how you created your wine law niche?
Sure, thanks. I've always enjoyed wine as a consumer, and it's always been an area of sort of academic interest to me. What really prompted me to get involved is that I had a friend who was a wine importer in BC, and he told me that there wasn't anybody in the province who really understood how the liquor system worked in BC and who was able to provide advice on the regulations that are part of the system. So I ended up sort of thinking about that for a while and thinking that's kind of an interesting sideline area. And I went down actually to UC Davis, which has a program called the Wine Executive Program. Wasn't really sure whether it would be relevant to Canadian context, but it ended up being super relevant to the Canadian context. And I learned a lot down there, particularly from a fellow who's probably the grandfather of North American wine law, a guy named Richard Mendelson, who I recently saw actually in Kelowna. So yeah, I came back and joined a bunch of wine and liquor industry associations and then just started doing it as a sideline. And then eventually it kind of took over my whole career in a happy way.
And here you are. And so that's an interesting point. You mentioned the conference that we attended recently, and we'll get back to that. But I remember one of the comments there was, wine law. What is that? Is that a special area of practice, or is it the way that law will apply to the world in which we engage with each other in manufacturing wine? And so that takes us, I think, to the point about here in British Columbia, we have a really complex and layered set of rules and regulations about really anything to do about alcohol, whether it's producing, It's distributing, selling, or drinking alcohol. As I understand it, a lot of this regulatory framework is based on and derived from how we emerged from Prohibition when it was repealed here in 1921. But before we get into some of the ins and outs around that, I'd just like to chat a little bit with you about the fact that we had Prohibition here in Canada. I think that we often think about Prohibition in the American context, things like the ban on drinking other than sacramental wine, the speakeasy culture, various bootlegging enterprises. But we had Prohibition here in Canada as well. So could you provide a little bit of an overview or a brief summary about when and why Prohibition started here in British Columbia or Canada more broadly? And maybe give a few examples of the types of things that people could and could not do during our Prohibition?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, like a lot of other places in North America, back, over 100 years ago now, there was a strong push, particularly from religious temperance organizations, to try and reduce alcohol consumption and ban it completely, because at the time it was thought that alcohol consumption was the cause of a lot of social problems. And that did happen, and those groups pushing for that were successful in British Columbia, as they were in most North American jurisdictions. Although in British Columbia, Prohibition was very short-lived. It only lasted from 1918 to 1921, as you just mentioned. It was not successful like it was in most places, because when you ban something that is being part of civilization and culture for hundreds, thousands of years, people generally don't accept that. And they, particularly people who were moderate drinkers, they were sort of the opinion that this is a crazy ban and we're just not going to pay attention to the rules. So there was a lot of, as you mentioned, we had speakeasies, we had bootlegging. There were a lot of those sorts of issues, although it just didn't last as long here. Prohibition ended in BC as a result of a referendum of the citizens of BC, where the people of BC were asked whether they wanted to carry on with Prohibition or whether they wanted to change to a system of government control. So those were the only two options that were presented during the referendum. And the latter option won quite handily. So Prohibition ended in 1921. But you're right. Like during that time, it was as in many other places in North America, it wasn't legal to sell alcohol. It wasn't legal to be engaged in the wine business at all. There were a lot of people who were doing so nefariously, the most prominent of which was actually probably the Prohibition Commissioner himself. Who,
oh, the irony.
Who was a guy, I can't remember his first name, but his last name was Findlay. And he was the one who was supposed to be enforcing all the laws, and he was actually arrested for bootlegging.
Oh, my goodness. Before the referendum, I'm assuming.
Yeah, before the referendum. So, it shows how kind of foolish some of these, sort of movements are, because it just didn't work. People weren't paying attention to it, and it caused a lot of problems. But there were also a lot of people in British Columbia too that actually made a lot of money through Prohibition. There was a pretty strong industry that carried on after Prohibition ended here, supplying the United States. And so you actually would have boats that would go down the coast, and smaller boats would come off the shore of Washington State or Oregon, and then they would get the booze from the boats and bring it back on shore. So there's actually kind of a healthy industry that was created during Prohibition. I think the thing that was quite interesting is that after Prohibition ended, as I mentioned, we switched to a system of government control. And the attitude here was that um, it was still could be problematic. And even though we'd gotten rid of prohibition, the only way to reduce those harms was to make sure that government was watching over the citizens in terms of their interactions with alcohol. So, for example, what happened was you ended up having a chain. The only way you could purchase alcohol was through government stores. And those stores were sort of grim Soviet era style retailers. They had frosted glass on the outside of the windows, so you couldn't see what was going on inside the stores. If you wanted to buy alcohol, you had to present a passbook, and they would keep track of how much alcohol you were buying.
Wow.
When
Wow.
you
Is there a
bought,
record of what your volume restrictions
yes,
were?
yeah, there was they kept track exactly of how much you were buying, so that you weren't buying too much. And
Interesting.
then when you bought the alcohol, none of it was displayed in the front of the store. It was all in the back. Somebody would sort of scurry back, then bring your bottle out in a brown paper bag, so that when you emerged from the store with your head hung low in shame, nobody else would be able to see that you were carrying a bottle of alcohol. So it was a very, very judgmental sort of system where you would have, the state is kind of watching over you and making sure that what you're doing is not going to cause harm.
So this is really interesting. It leads into another question I had, but the brown bagging, for example, at least I still use that as a cliche or a euphemism for certain things that is still in society, and I didn't know the derivation of that. And also the tinted windows and the frosted windows. I mean, I see that for other businesses now, dispensaries and other things in our society. So that's quite interesting more than 100 years later. So in addition to, the controlled stores and the state monopoly with respect to alcohol coming in with the repeal of prohibition, what are a few other examples of the legacy of prohibition now in terms of how we buy, wine, beer, or spirits in restaurants? I mean, we have private stores now, so it's not just the government-controlled stores. But, 100 years has passed, and it still seems that there are some examples of that legacy 100 years later within the context that we're here, let's say in British Columbia. Do you have any
Oh,
thoughts on that
yeah.
as a few examples?
Yeah, it absolutely. I mean, it took a long time we haven't completely dismantled the legacy of prohibition. I mean, for a long time in BC, um, it was, men and women had to enter bars separately. You had to, if you wanted to have a drink, you had to sit down at a table. You could not stand. At one point you couldn't even have any food. You just had to go and sit down and have your drink, and then you would leave
Oh
quietly.
my goodness, it's kind of
And
counterintuitive to today, which is,
yeah,
please have some food while you're having
it's
your wine or your beer.
totally crazy. And then you were not there was not allowed to be any entertainment. Um, it was a very sort of grim affair.
Serious. It was a
Um,
serious pursuit, it
Yeah,
sounds like.
very serious. And so, and those sorts of rules carried on for a long time. Like even the restrictions on entertainment for a long time in British Columbia, there were rules about how much, the kinds of entertainment you could have in a restaurant or bar that served alcohol. There were rules about such silly things as the size of the televisions that you could have in a bar in a restaurant in British Columbia. Um, and and there were rules too about how much alcohol could be served to people. And you had, for restaurants, for a long time, you couldn't order any alcohol unless you were also ordering a meal. So you were not able to come in and just sit down and have a glass of wine. You would have to order a meal, or for a while, it was a bit of a joke because you had to have a serious intention to eat. So you'd walk into the restaurant with a serious intention to eat, and then after having your drink, you'd say, "Well, actually, I've lost my appetite."
So it's, often said that through crisis comes renewal, or at least some change. And it seems there were a few silver linings coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of the relaxation of some of the rules and regulations, what we have in our market around us regarding the sale and use and responsible enjoyment of wine and other alcoholic beverages. Can you share a few examples of some of these changes or modifications that were made as a result of the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic, and whether you think these changes are here to stay, or the status of those?
Sure. I mean, one of the things that I've always kind of thought was weird in BC was the strange reluctance of the licensing authorities and municipalities as well to allow drinking outside a licensed establishment. I'm originally from England, and in London, for example, it's very common for patrons of a pub to stand outside the pub, and especially if it's warm on a nice summer night or something, you might stand outside the pub with your beer, drinking and socializing, and just sort of having a chat with people. In British Columbia, there were very restrictive rules for a long time about patio service, and it was very hard to get a patio license. If you did get a patio license, you had to basically build a giant barricades all around it. It was not permitted that a server could cross like a sidewalk to get to your patio. Your patio had to be directly adjacent to your licensed establishment. There were a lot of crazy kind of rules like that that don't really make any sense. And you kind of think, well, why would you be so worried about the fact that, the server is walking across the sidewalk to serve somebody? In Paris, I've been there quite a few times, and on nice warm days, pretty much all the cafes put a whole bunch of tables outside, and suddenly there's a nice little social scene where people can sit down and enjoy themselves. And here, it was just not possible to do that because you had to have this kind of fenced off area that where you were allowed to serve alcohol, and you couldn't serve it anywhere else except in that fenced off area. So that was a big change that happened during the pandemic, as a result of wanting to have people sit outside where there's better ventilation and less likelihood to spread COVID. They changed the rules, and so temporarily, a lot of bars and restaurants were allowed to have areas where they could serve alcohol, which previously they would never have been allowed to have done that. And you probably, you can see that Main Street was a really good example. A whole lot of cafes and restaurants along Main Street would have little pop-up patios, sometimes out on the road, or maybe just around the corner from where the business was. And those sorts of changes, I think will become, a lot of them have been kind of temporarily kept being extended, but I think they will change because people now have gotten used to it, and they're sort of saying, well, I've been to Europe or somewhere else in the world where this has happened for hundreds of years and has never really caused any problems. Why did we prevent it from happening in the first place? And when we tried it out, it didn't cause any problems. It's totally fine.
So maybe just changing a little bit topic to away from, for the moment, from consumption and where you consume to what you're having and what you're looking at on, let's say, a bottle or a can of wine or an alcoholic beverage. One thing that came up when you and I recently attended the International Wine Law Conference in Kelowna here in British Columbia is a topic around labeling. There were lawyers and advocates and policy experts from all over the world attending this conference. And we had some discussion around the labeling of wine bottles and cans and where things are going in terms of nutrition panels, listing specific ingredients in the product, caloric content. as well as other types of information statements and warnings. We talked about how the EU now has regulations which have to go on all the labels, and anyone exporting to the EU needs to be mindful of and fall within those regulations. And in the States, there's also increased discussion about the labels on wines. Right now, it's not like how we look at food packages here in Canada, where every ingredient is listed. We don't have that right now at the moment for wine. Where do you think this is going? Where do you think this might head to in Canada in consumers increasingly want to know what they're eating, so to speak?
Yeah, historically, alcohol, wine, beer, and spirits has been exempt from the ingredient labeling and nutritional labeling requirements that are common on other foodstuffs. I think that is going to change. I think that there will be more of a movement to provide more information to consumers, because that's what consumers want. I think they do want to know what the ingredients are in their wine. They want to know sometimes what the caloric content is. Sometimes it's even questions about just traceability and knowing exactly where the grapes came from. And I think that is going to become more common. I think that there may be a bit of a debate about how much information is required and how that information is presented. Typically, a wine label on a bottle is not very large, so you don't have a lot of real estate to include all the information that people might want. But happily, we're now in a highly technological world, and it's not very hard to provide a link, a QR code or something else, so that the consumer can immediately find out what the ingredients are in that particular bottle of wine, what the caloric content is, and things like that. And I'm totally supportive of that. There are some progressive wineries that already do that. There's a winery in California, Ridge, that's done that for decades. They always put the ingredients on their labels. And I think that's a good idea. And I think it's the way that things are moving internationally. As you had mentioned, it's already going to happen in the EU starting in December. And I think that'll be the way that things move around the world. There'll be more.
Yeah, certainly from some of the British Columbia producers I've spoken with, this is of interest, and I think people see where things are heading. And your comment about information and QR codes, people are really interested in learning more about the product and where it comes from and the story. And I think particularly as the industry is considering changing trends in the demographic and what's happening with wine consumption, and if there's a concern that younger generations are maybe from an industry perspective, maybe they're interested in a broad range of products in the alcohol sphere, and that younger consumers really like to know more about where their product comes from and want to be on that journey. And I think the QR code is something that we're going to see a lot more on wine bottles for that reason and others. I think the traceability one is a great point. But this is all part of the conversation, I think, on labeling and information for the consumer. And just on that, moving to a topic which I know is something you're working really closely with right now and is a very hot topic in the global wine industry, is around health warnings being made about wine products. So, for example, this comes up in the context of wine bottle labeling, where there are explicit warnings about health effects of drinking alcohol. Ireland in particular has very prescriptive rules now about what goes on labels, pictures of pregnant women and their bellies on labels and so forth. There's also a lot of discourse around recommended drinking guidelines. So here in Canada, for those who don't know, there recently, or last year, I guess it was a report tabled by the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction, the CCSA. And that's getting a lot of global attention right now because it recommended that we, the consumers, have 2 drinks per week, as opposed to the existing health guidelines here in our country, which would contemplate more like 2 drinks a day. Now, Mark, I know you might refine and correct my paraphrasing, but in general terms, the CCSA recommended guidelines it would be a big shift, a huge shift, not only in the Canadian context, but vis-a-vis what's happening out there globally right now. So, Mark, you've been working very closely in relation to analyzing and assessing that report. Can you tell us a little bit more about, those recommended guidelines, the status of those recommendations, and some of the discussion that's going around right now in terms of responding to them or analyzing them?
Sure. Yes, those recommendations are obviously a dramatic change from the previous guidelines that were issued by Health Canada. The previous guidelines were put out in 2011, and Health Canada asked a small advisory group to look at them and to come up with some recommendations as to whether they should be changed. The report that small advisory group came up with is dramatically different from the previous guidelines. So it's kind of was a bit of a bombshell to consumers and to industry alike. Something seemed a little off. It was like, well, either you were dramatically wrong in 2011 or you're dramatically wrong today, because how could things change so much in such a short period of time? Our view at the Canadian Association for Responsible Drinkers is that this is contrary to common sense. People have safely consumed in moderation for hundreds, thousands of years. I mean, I know plenty of people, friends and family, who have consumed in moderation throughout their whole lives, including my own dad. He's 85 years old now. And this sort of thing, like you just look at it and you go, this does not make sense, like, at a base level. But it also doesn't make sense scientifically either. I mean, there's decades of scientific research that show that those who drink in moderation live about as long or longer even than people who don't drink at all. And there are literally hundreds of studies that have proved that. And there are still studies coming out now in 2022, 2023 that show exactly the same thing. So I think what happened with this CCSA report is you ended up with a small group of people who are ideologically opposed to alcohol, who kind of wrested control of that process. And they have just changed the way that they're looking at the science, and they've come up with different conclusions in terms of what the risks are. We don't think that this is a sensible way to go about looking at it. Historically, the approach in Canada has been to focus on harmful consumption and try and reduce that. And that approach has been very successful. The vast majority of Canadians, about 85%, drink in moderation. Statistics Canada recently reported that their analysis showed the lowest levels of heavy drinking that they've ever recorded in Canada.
Wow.
So, it worked. Like what we were doing before worked.
Mm-hmm.
And to change the public health message from you should not engage in harmful consumption or heavy drinking, to change that message to you should only have 2 drinks per week, and in fact, no level is safe at all. I think that is going to cause people to stop listening completely to the public health messaging, and is actually going to cause harm, because people who have an issue with drinking and are drinking heavily or in a harmful way are just going to tune out of that message completely. And I think that this is not a sensible way to approach the situation from a liquor policy perspective.
And I guess, I know that I expect that you've pored over the report, and, there will be underlying data that was relied upon for those recommendations to be put forward. But what I find is interesting, or maybe in broad terms, is there any commentary in the report or around it about we're not living in bubbles. So kind of like, oh, well, how do you balance this with the fact that that person who has a certain number of servings per week of wine also just eats a ton of nacho chips or trans fats or a lot of sugar or other things that apparently, as well as humans were consuming or how we move in this world, can bring risk to ourselves, to our beings, depending on moderation and our DNA and a whole bunch of factors. So, how did they deal with things like that in the report? In broad terms, I know this is very
Yeah.
scientific, but in broad
Well,
terms.
they will claim that they tried to address some of those issues, but it's not possible to address those issues from a scientific perspective. There's what they would call too many confounding factors when you're looking at something like this. So it's very hard to figure out when you're looking at people's alcohol consumption and if they end up getting sick. Was it the alcohol consumption that caused that, or was it the fact that they were eating too much fast food, or the
Right.
fact that they didn't exercise,
Yeah.
or
Stress.
or stress, or maybe
Yeah.
they have a genetic history of that
Right.
particular sickness? So it's very hard, and in fact, you shouldn't be making scientific causation conclusions from these sorts of studies because you don't have the data to support that.
Right.
And it's, particularly when you start then making sweeping statements about there's no safe level of consumption and you should only drink 2 drinks per week. Those are jumps in logic that should not be made based on the underlying science. And particularly one of the things that I think, not just me, but academics and other scientists and doctors have criticized this report for is exaggerating the risks. And for example, they might say, there's one point where it says, "Oh, there's 100% increase in the risk of tuberculosis if you are drinking in moderation," but tuberculosis is a disease that's almost exclusively connected to poverty and poor housing and poor nutrition.
Mm-hmm.
The risk of getting that in Canada is minuscule. It's like 2 in a million. So even if there's 100% increase, it's still only 4 in a million.
Right. So it's taking a step back or looking at things from altitude about the numbers and practical terms, what this really means. Fascinating. So you've mentioned the Canadian Association for Responsible Drinkers. You've recently become the executive director of that association, and I understand it's a newly formed group. Could you just tell us a little bit more about it? Who it's for, what your mission is. It sounds to me that it's for awareness raising, and perhaps making sure there's more balanced scientific information that's tabled in the public forum is an arena. Is that correct, or what's going on?
Our objective is to provide more sensible, balanced, unbiased information. And if listeners are wondering, they can go to the website, which is cafrd.ca, and they can find a lot of information there about this CCSA report, about the people who are speaking up against it and saying that it's misleading. And you can see much more balanced, sort of sensible information about alcohol consumption. And I mean, one of the things, our real mission is to educate people about moderate consumption, to discourage harmful consumption, and particularly to encourage people to make informed choices for themselves. Everybody is different. A one-size-fits-all solution, which is what CCSA is putting forward, is not appropriate in this context. People have different lifestyles, they have different diets, they have different medical histories. What people should be doing is educating themselves about the risks. And there could well be people who decide they shouldn't drink at all. And that's absolutely, the right choice for them. There could be other people who look at their overall situation and say, well, I have a family history of this particular type of disease, and therefore, if I'm going to drink, I should only drink lightly. And then there could be other people who would decide, well, I'm not really at risk because, I otherwise have a healthy lifestyle. And for me, a moderate consumption can be totally part of that healthy lifestyle and is not going to pose any appreciable risks. And for the most part, the risks associated with moderate alcohol consumption are in line with the risks that we accept in life generally.
Interesting what you mentioned about looking at this from a liquor policy point of view. And in my mind, when you said that, it took me back to the beginning of our conversation about prohibition and how you said it didn't work. Essentially, the people were like, you know what? No, this doesn't make sense for us. I mean, I'm using the vernacular. We'll have a referendum, and there was a considered choice about to come out of prohibition and what that would look like, in which case there was state monopoly and state regulations to ensure that there was, for peace, order, and good government and health and safety. And so it's interesting. So coming back to that, I've heard the term neo-prohibition being used recently in the context of various observers describing, these underlying currents or the discourse around things like you mentioned, like no safe amount when it comes to drinking wine, or in the context of labeling on wine and alcohol packages, explicit health warnings, things like maybe analogous to what the tobacco industry has faced in the past. Are you hearing neo-prohibition come up in a global discussion right now amongst wine industry observers or consumers, or do you see different perspectives on this inside and outside of Canada? I mean, is it fair or accurate to even use this term in terms of the current landscape, do you think?
I think it is fair to use the term because I think that there is a small but growing and somewhat successful neo-prohibition movement out there. And it is international. To some extent, it is happening at the World Health Organization. And it has been happening to some extent in Canada as well. We have some people in Canada, some who were involved with the CCSA report, who are very anti-alcohol. Some of them are associated with a movement which is actually a temperance movement. That's how it originally got started. And I think that it is not really appropriate. You mentioned, the experience with prohibition. It's not really appropriate for people who have a bias to be involved in the formulation of liquor policy. Got some people who are stridently anti-alcohol, and they're coming up with these recommendations, which are really out in left field on a global context. But we shouldn't be asking people who have those sorts of polarized views to be involved in this sort of liquor policy making, because you're not going to get a reasonable, sensible result which people are going to listen to. You're going to end up with a situation like they had during Prohibition. You're going to end up with bad policy which doesn't work. And I think that's what you're starting to see here. You're getting bad policy recommendations which won't work and are not helpful at all. As I said, people should be making their own choices based on education and information. Government should not be telling them on a blanket one-size-fits-all basis that this is the solution, because it's not the solution for individual people. That's just a policy solution that an ideology has created.
I think that we could probably go on for a day about this. I know we have discussed it at length before, and I think this provides a really good overview of where we've come from and what's underpinning some of the conversations now and whether we're going back to anything or not. So, people can go to your website to learn more, and I would recommend people do so. There's a very interesting FAQ and a little bit more about who supports and about the CCSA report. So thank you so much for that. I feel that we've really just scratched the surface on this during this discussion. I think we could speak for hours. But we need to leave it for today. So I'd like to thank you for joining me and for sharing what I know is really just a small amount of your vast knowledge and experience in these matters. I'd also like to thank you for your efforts to raise awareness for consumers about all of this, the information, the statements swirling around out there about health warnings and claims in relation to enjoying and tasting wine. For me personally, my view is that we as consumers should be afforded balanced and scientifically sound information that we can rely on to make our own choices regarding our responsible consumption of alcohol. So I really would love to thank you for your contribution, and I look forward to hopefully clinking a glass of Pinot Noir with you soon.
Absolutely, and thank you very much for having me on. I really enjoyed the chat.
Thank you for joining me on my TT Wine Explorer podcast today. Stay tuned for the next episode. You can follow me on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Until then, remember to keep tasting, learning, and living.